of one's Christian duty to support what in the United States is known as religious liberty, or conversely, it's a synonym that they use, religious freedom. Is that a Christian responsibility? Is that something that Christians should support? As I said on Wednesday's transmission, there's a clip that is now making the rounds once again on social media of John MacArthur. This was not too long before he died, where he said that as Christians, we're not called, and neither should we, support the idea of religious liberty, or, again, as a synonym, religious freedom. We're going to look at the clip, and we're going to examine necessarily what that even means. Christians supporting religious liberty, and if it is, in fact, in alignment with Christian principles, or if it is something that is really more a pragmatism, more of an act of political self-preservation more than anything else. I think you'll want to stick around because I think we'll have a lively discussion, an important, nuanced, but substantive discussion on the matter on today's live stream of Irrespective. Welcome each and every one of you to this new episode. Happy Sunday. For those of you that are watching from the beginning, I hope that you'll stick around to the end. A couple of items to remind you of, housekeeping before we continue. Do not forget to subscribe if you have not done so yet, whether you're watching this through X, Rumble, or YouTube. Whatever your preferred platform, please remember to subscribe to our account on your preferred platform. If you are on Rumble or YouTube, hit that notification bell if you haven't yet to be alerted as to when we go live next or whenever we post new content to our pages. Which, by the way, we go live consistently every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to click that thumbs up button. You know how it is. It's an algorithms game out there. One of the best ways that you can help us to spread the word of Irrespective's existence is to smash that thumbs up button. If there is organic interest in our content, then the algorithms were to pick up on that organic interest and begin to suggest our content with others. And also, you can just directly share our content with others. For those of you that have been doing that, thank you so much for helping us in this manner. Don't forget that you can also interact with me by placing your question or your comment in the chat, whether you're watching this again on X, YouTube, or Rumble. Place your comments or questions in the live chat so you can participate in this live stream. Donate. It helps us to continue to keep the lights on here on Irrespective. There's a QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that you can scan. Conversely, there's a link available to you in the description box that you can click or tap on depending on the device you're using to watch this live stream. Last but not least, follow us on the socials. We are on X. Irrespective77 is the username on X. And on TikTok, our username is The Irrespective. All right, let me go ahead and play the clip. Again, this is something that MacArthur said, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of years ago, but it's making the rounds once again. And let me explain why before I play the clip now, because I think it's important to contextualize this in the moment that we find ourselves. The reason that now many Christians are playing this again and trying to spread this to other believers is because of what is happening in the country. We spoke about it a little bit on Wednesday's transmission, but again, so that we can contextualize why this clip is going viral once again on social media, it's because a lot of Christians have awoken to the evils and the inherent dangers of multiculturalism. For many years, it was practically assumed that under Christian principles, a nation and its people could inherently survive under the creed that says we will tolerate one another's existence as long as we agree to tolerate one another's existence. We can coexist. That's a buzzword that was used. You've seen that term used on bumper stickers everywhere, especially by those that are of the progressive persuasion on their vehicles. We can coexist. We can have different peoples from different backgrounds and different beliefs all residing in the same nation as long as we hold to the idea that we can coexist with one another, that we tolerate, as it were, one another's differences. Problem is that human nature, as I was saying on Wednesday, does play an important role on whether or not that can last. you do have to understand that human nature being what it is, and it's an important part, and it's something that the Bible talks about consistently, and it's a factor that Christians have to make part of their thought process when analyzing, when examining, when discerning things, because it is an essential part of what it means to be human, and it plays a role. That's why the Bible makes such an emphasis on what human nature is, how it participates, how it acts, how it is an essential part of what it means to be human, et cetera, all these things. It's important for us to take that as a factor in our examination and discernment of things. So when you consider that, and you consider that one's allegiances to one's nation, to one's religious creeds, et cetera, that is going to determine a person's behavior, then you begin to see that the entire multicultural experiment was always destined to fail from the very beginning. It could be that initially it might have given the impression that that wasn't going to be the case, but ultimately it was going to be destined to fail. Why? Well, I'm hearkening on Jesus' words. Jesus says, and it's a principle that you see observed over and over again, a house divided shall not stand. When you take that principle and you apply it, whether it be in spiritual matters of allegiance, whether it be in national matters of allegiance, whether it be to other types of allegiances, guess what? The principle always plays out. It's always going to have a manifestation in the end. Jesus says you can't serve God and mammon. You either love the one and hate the other, or vice versa. That principle plays out. Either you love your wife more than the other woman that is trying to get with you, as it were, or you don't love your wife enough and you end up going with that other woman. Your allegiance is going to be directed in one way, ultimately, more than the other. Either you love one country or another. There is no such thing as dual allegiances. I've talked about this. I've heard many so-called conservative podcasters talk about dual allegiances. There is no such thing. You either love one more than the other, you'll hate the other. That's just the way it is. That's just human nature. Well, going back to the point, multiculturalism eventually was destined to fail, because what ends up happening is that you are demanding of everyone to put down, to tamp down in their lives that of first principles and allegiances. And let me tell you something. Most of the time, you're not going to get people to abandon, as it were, first and principal allegiances, or you're not going to get them to abandon what human nature dictates, in a sense. Or let me not present it as it were this invisible third party that somehow controls people's decision-making process. So whatever the person decides, his free will is important, right? It's whatever the person decides they are going to be allegiant to first and foremost. That is what ultimately is going to determine their course of action. So what ends up happening? You have a nation then filled with people whom are imported, as it were, from other countries. And they're going to bring with them their customs, their inclinations, and their religious ideas. And those religious ideas are necessarily going to be at odds with the religious foundations of a country like the United States, which was explicitly, doesn't matter what the Zionists will tell you, was explicitly Christian from its very inception. When you look at the first Immigration and Nationality Act, or Nationality Act, that was passed in the United States in 1790, it explicitly prohibited immigration into the country except to free white persons of good moral character. When you look at the people whom composed the nation's peoples, the people groups that settled the nation at its founding, it was Christians. Sure, you had by Christians, it's a broad definition. Let me be a bit more specific. You had Catholics, but they were the minority. It was mostly Protestants that formulated and founded this country. So when they said white people of, as it were, good moral character, you know what they meant by that. In other words, they wanted other Christians to come into the nation because they wanted to keep the nation's ethos, its creed, explicitly Christian. Noah Webster, one of the founders of the country, was explicit in that this was the sentiment put forth by the founders at this country. However, as the progressive era is introduced into the country and it becomes more and more popular, the nation's people were convinced that it was somehow part and parcel of the Christian ethic to allow the stranger and the foreigner to come into the nation. And not that they would, as it were, be absorbed by what Americanism necessarily means, which inherent to it was Christianity, but to allow those people to come into the country and now impose their ideas, ultimately washing out what it meant to be American and the Christianity that undergirded it. And ultimately, this led many Christians to the belief that somehow religious, as it were, freedom or religious liberty was important to defend. There was also a pragmatic argument to be had with this. What do I mean by that? Well, you had lawsuits that were happening and court cases that were occurring in the 20th century and a little bit before, when you had persons whom were not Christians, whom were going to the court saying, my views, my religion is being suppressed by my state, my local government, the federal authorities, what have you, even though the Constitution, for example, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, specifically says that I can exercise my religion freely. Curiously enough, though, that's the very same amendment that was used by these people to impose the respecting of, the recognition of religions that are directly and diametrically opposed to Christianity. So it is in light of all of this that you see all these things, and now, again, contextualizing the clip that I'm about to show you, you see where John MacArthur and others, they end up saying Christians are not called to support religious liberty or religious freedom, whichever phrase you'd like to use, because inherently what that means is necessarily endorsing indirectly that which opposes Christianity. Now, when you think upon it in principle, it makes sense. As a Christian, I'm not called to endorse the idea of the allowance of a religion that contradicts Christianity. As a matter of fact, that seeks its destruction, because there are very many religions in the world, false religions, of course, all of them, that look to, in essence, they spar with Christianity for supremacy. One of them, as more and more people are finding out, is Zionism, Judaism. Another one is Islam. You have all these differing sects that call themselves Christianity, but in fact what they're trying to do is they're trying to make their own version of Christianity supreme. You have all of these different so-called faiths competing for supremacy in a singular nation. Going back to Jesus' principle, then what ends up happening to the nation if all of these different peoples are moving in different directions? That nation is not going to stand. That community, that family, whatever the case may be, the principle is applicable. Let's listen to the clip, and then I'll share more thoughts on it, because, again, this is one of those topics that requires nuance, requires substantive Christian thinking on the matter to arrive at a point where I think a biblical point of view on the matter.
No Christian with half a brain would say, we support religious freedom. I read the other day that the new administration will uphold religious freedom. Really? I don't even support religious freedom. Religious freedom is what sends people to hell. To say I support religious freedom is to say I support idolatry. It's to say I support lies. I support hell. I support the kingdom of darkness. You can't say that. We support the truth.
So it becomes evident what MacArthur was pointing to there. And if you need the explanation, I'll give it to you. The foundational argument that he is pointing to is Christians are commanded, not called to, I guess you can use it synonymously, but commanded is much more rooted in what Jesus teaches. Christians are commanded to be, their ultimate allegiance to be to the gospel, yes? Which means that if we're talking about the exclusivity of Jesus Christ, then it means that the denunciation of everything that isn't Christ. That's the simplest way to teach it. If Christianity teaches ultimate allegiance to the Christian truth, then it also means the denunciation of everything that isn't Christian truth. Ergo, if Christians support religious freedom, that's the phrase that is used, religious liberty, then in essence you're endorsing everything that isn't Christianity. and allowing that to compete with the exclusive truth that Christianity has to offer. That's in essence the argument philosophically that MacArthur is pointing out. So he says, in essence, philosophically, he didn't use the word, but I'm using it to give you an explanation for what he is advancing here. In essence, any Christian that argues on behalf of religious freedom, religious liberty, is in essence going against the exclusivity of the gospel. That's why he says you're in essence endorsing idolatry. But I know what some Christians are thinking. But if I don't defend that, then necessarily I'm opening the door for the government to ultimately criminalize my faith, ultimately criminalize Christianity. So the math that they make in their minds is as follows. I have to defend the First Amendment religious freedom concept that stems from the First Amendment, lest the government prohibit me from practicing my faith freely and openly. So if you think about it, there's a pragmatic argument to be made in favor of supporting religious freedom. It's the same concept that Jerry Falwell, many years ago, had when he himself made a party to the lawsuits that were moving against the Moonies. It's a pagan sect from Asia that made its way into the United States. And he said that it was important for him and other Christians to join in on the defense of their religious liberties, because his thinking on the matter was, if the government can come after them, then the government can come after us, ultimately. But here's where the equation starts getting a bit hazy. And again, I'd like to just use all of this to explain away the thought process and why, again, contextually, people are now starting to rethink, Christians are beginning to rethink this entire concept of religious freedom in the first place. Because when you understand the history of the foundation of the United States, as I've said before, it was a country created by Christians and for Christians. But then you run into the Thomas Jeffersons of life and the other deists that said, wait a minute, we have to have separation of church and state, because we don't want what happened in England to happen to us, where the state, as it were, sanctioned a state religion, and anything that went against that was criminalized. But when you look at the context of the people that founded the nation, the majority of the people that were here were Protestants. There's a reason why King George III ended up calling the American Revolution the Presbyterian War, because it was mostly Presbyterian pastors, clergymen, who were propelling forward ideologically and in other ways materially supporting the American Revolution and the revolutionaries themselves. It was Protestants that pushed forward the idea of rebellion against the king and rebellion against a state-sponsored religion, as it was in England with respect to Anglicanism. So it's in light of all that, once you understand all of that, where you have to come to the conclusion of, well, who's right? You have to ask yourself the question, who's right? Is MacArthur right? Because principally speaking, he's correct on the matter. But then I also have to understand the pragmatic argument that if I suddenly go against this, then the government at any point can turn around and jail me for preaching the gospel, living in a Christian manner, et cetera, et cetera. I have to pick a side. But here's the problem. Now you throw another monkey wrench into all of this debate. We're now in a country that historically was created by Christians and for Christians. The government has decidedly, even though the First Amendment is on the books, has become decidedly, at the local level, at the state level, and even at the federal level, decidedly anti-Christian. I don't need to go through the long history and the most recent history to demonstrate that the American government, the state governments, and the local governments have actively and continually persecuted Christians above and beyond other faiths, so-called, other religions. I gave you a recent example a week ago. Look at what happened in Dallas, Texas, where there was a pride parade going on, and the local police were threatening to fine and even jail local Christian preachers for simply speaking out against the sodomites that were exhibiting their nudity to the kids out in the streets. Saying that, yes, religious freedom is a thing, but you don't have the right to offend. The guy who's running for governor here, one of the guys who's running for governor here in Florida, Jay Collins, a couple of months ago, he said on a podcast that, yes, you have freedom of expression, but you don't have the right to offend somebody. What? You see, these are the things that are happening now where you throw the monkey wrench in, and now you begin to see why Christians are saying, wait a minute, but people like MacArthur were right, and others that are making the arguments, or similar arguments, are right, because look at how the current government, the current makeup, it is, how it's happening now, and you see how Christians are being persecuted now, and you ask yourself, so what am I defending religious liberty for if my religious freedoms, so-called, my religious liberty is being tampered. It's being trampled upon. I'm not able to exercise it, but the Hindu is. I'm not able to exercise it, but the Muslim is. I'm not able to exercise it, but the Satanist is able to put his statue up in the state capitol. And I can't protest against it. So what happens? Well, I'm going to give you my point of view in all of this, because these are difficult questions that Christians have to answer. But I'm going to take it back to the foundational so that you can have a firm grasp of where one has to, I think, ultimately answer those questions in one's mind. Because we are talking about an issue of conscience here, ultimately. First and foremost, MacArthur is foundationally right. When you think about it, no Christian is commanded to defend false religion. All the opposite is true. The Christian is called by the faith that he espouses to defend the one faith given for all time, once and for all, to the saints. That is the faith, the true faith, that the Christian is called to defend. Conversely, we have verses in the Bible, plenty of them, that talk about denunciating that which is false, bringing down every argument that stands against the knowledge of Christ, Paul writes. Speaking the truth, like Paul writes to Titus, to the Cretans, so that they may be sound in the faith. Plenty of texts where it says that Christians are to chastise, rebuke, and call out falsehood by name, explicitly. But then on the other side of it, you look at the landscape and you're saying, boy, if I don't defend that First Amendment, government at any point can actually come against me. So does that mean that for pragmatist purposes, do I actually join that effort, as it were, to defend this person's ability for them to exercise their religion, lest they come after mine? The problem is, as I said earlier, you've got government coming after Christians for their faith. And that has been the case now for decades now, because the country has decidedly become secular a long time ago. And dare I say, the Christian faith is the one that they are directly targeting more than anything else, because they don't have a problem with Hindus. And by they, I'm talking about the powers that be. They don't have a problem with Islam. They don't have a problem with any of them. It's Christianity that they have a problem with. That's just the straight up truth. So the Christian is in a conundrum. The Bible, Christianity proper, tells me that this is not the way that I proceed, because thereby I'm actually, ergo, in a way, defending this person's false religion, or that false religion, or that false sect, or whatever the case may be. But on the other end, I don't want government coming after me, but the government is coming after me. So now I'm in a conundrum. What do I do? Well, this is where I believe that you could have, I don't even want to say the best of both worlds. I just think that it's, as it were, a way to just defend Christianity proper and exclusively. First and foremost, the solution would be for Christians to embolden themselves once again, as it was at one point in this country, to proclaim Christianity and do it openly. The problem that we have in this country is that Christians for many years have allowed their counterparts, their opponents, their enemies, to feel emboldened at their expense. Meaning, boy, I'm going to defend you, but then the people that say they're going to help defend me, ultimately I'm going to use that as a vehicle to come back and now try to tamp down Christianity or oppose it in some way, shape, or form. If you think about it, Islam has worked like that for some time. In the country, they have actually used the religious liberty laws, in a sense, to begin to take over and try to displace Christianity as it was in this country at a given point. They are using the laws that Christians themselves put in place at the fear of, we don't want to be persecuted by government, against Christians. That has to be recognized. But the way that you kick that back, as it were, you hold that back, is by, in essence, disallowing those whom think differently in that way from us. The thing is that the political will is not there, because somehow that's going to make us racist or whatnot, whatever that means, right? That's one of those nebulous buzzwords that are used to try to get people to feel intimidated because they don't want to get called something. But ultimately, if you're thinking about the protection of Christians and Christianity, why wouldn't you institute something that necessarily, as it were, protects Christianity proper? But one of the ways to do that, and Christians have abdicated that in a country that was built by their spiritual forebears for them, the way that you do that is by boldly living out the gospel, preaching it, living it. No, for many years now, as I've profiled before, it's keep your faith to yourself, privatize your Christianity. It doesn't matter if the Hindus live it out loud. It doesn't matter if the Islamists live it out loud. You just want to be nice. You want to be accepted and well-liked by others. So just keep it to yourself. That's a problem, because you're in essence abdicating the very space that was given to us by our spiritual forebears to actually keep that alive in the public square. I've said it before. One classic example of this is Benjamin Franklin giving of his own money to people like George Whitefield to preach from the state courthouses, city courthouses like Philadelphia and whatnot, so they could preach the gospel, because Franklin knew that it was an essential public good for Christianity to be promoted. And Franklin was a deist and a philanderer. Franklin had his problems, but yet he saw the benefit of Christianity being the main faith of the United States. Interesting. But the thing is, like I said before, Christians have abdicated that because, no, we're just going to privatize our faith. No, you live it out loud. That's the first thing. Number two, how about if Christians now actually start standing up for Christians? Just like the Muslims have their groups that look out for each other, just like the Hindus or the Mormons or what have you have their groups that look out for each other, why don't Christians support more of the groups that look out for themselves? Oh, because somehow it's not part of the Christian ethic, we've been convinced, to do that. What? Yeah, you have to love the sinner. Wait a minute. At the expense of those in the faith? I think I've read somewhere in the Bible, and this is Paul, by the way, yes, and I'm paraphrasing, try to get along with everyone. As long as it's in your power, you do that. But make sure that you treat those of the faith especially well. So there was a partiality there that Paul himself advanced with respect to Christians and other Christians. I mean, you see it all over his letters. So why are we all of a sudden averse to seeing the plight of other Christians and saying, well, it is what it is, and we're just going to stay quiet about it, when others are actually doing that to their own in-group preferences at their benefit and at the expense of Christians. And Christians are seeing that and they're saying, oh, well, what can you do? That's God's will. What? What I'm saying is that if you see that other Christians, and I'm not saying there aren't Christians that do this, but they're in the minority. Most Christians have gripped to the idea, they've basically said, it's best for us to just privatize our faith because we just want to be liked. Well, then enjoy being considered a minority in the country that was founded by your forebears, your spiritual forebears. Because it's turning out that the country that was built by our people, for our people, is being slowly and has been slowly taken over by people whom are inherently enemies of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Can't have it both ways. And then the third thing that I think that is necessary for us, and again, we have to have the spine to do it, and there's nothing anti-biblical about it, is to, in essence, say anybody that comes in with different ideas that inherently opposes Christianity, they need to be kicked out. Yeah, but Jesus says, this is one argument that I've heard, Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world. Yes, and? Well, he also said that if his followers were looking to make him king and establish a kingdom now, that, all that geo. And I would say to that person, didn't Jesus say that we are to go out into the nations and make disciples? If we are to make disciples in the nations, wouldn't that necessarily if we start making a lot of disciples, wouldn't that necessarily turn the nations Christian? What happened to Rome when Christians started spreading the gospel? Rome became Christian. Sure, I get it. It devalued into something that came to be known as Catholicism. I get it. But you don't fail to see the main point here. If you go out and spread the gospel and people start becoming Christians, guess what happens to the society at large? It becomes Christian. That's just their natural consequence. Why do you think Islam spent all those years, and it's still doing it, where they're going and trying to convert by force peoples, nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? They do it by the sword. Christians are called to do it by messaging and by living it out. And one way to protect, as it were, inherently, your ability to practice your faith is by ensuring that the society that you live in stays inherently Christian. Not simply giving that away under the guise of tolerance, with which we have already denounced in the past and will continue to do so. Because principally, MacArthur is correct. Why support this idea when inherently it's going to lead to the very thing that's supporting the advancement of that which is an enemy of the gospel of Jesus Christ? That's essentially true. So I think in these 3 points I've been able to demonstrate that there is a way to thread these things in a way that doesn't violate biblical principles, but at the same time doesn't give any air, any oxygen to the enemies of Christ. But the problem is that, as I said, you've got people whom are so indoctrinated and brainwashed with the idea of tolerance and Christian toleration that weaponized the weaponization of Christianity against itself and against its people, that whenever I bring up, like what I said in the 3rd point, you kick out people that are inherently anti-Christian, doesn't matter what shape or form they take. Oh, we can't do that. Why? Who says you can't? Point me to the text in the Bible that says you can't do that. No, because we're inherently pushing people away from the gospel of Jesus Christ. I have a solution then. Present them the gospel and then kick them out. See? Easy peasy. You did your job. You presented the gospel. Irrespective of whether they accept it or not, good. You know what? You get to be a Christian. Now go do it in your own country. I preached the gospel. I did my job. Now go do it in your country. Jesus did say to go make disciples of the nations. Right? You're not violating any precept, but you're ensuring that the supremacy that Christianity has or had at one point in a particular nation stays that way. You're not giving air and comfort to those that are actually enemies of Jesus Christ. That's all I have to say on the matter. If you have disagreements with me on the matter, go ahead and air it in the chat. Let me know. Although I think I've established a pretty good, what I would say fundamentally correct way to view this matter biblically. You're going to have to argue this on the substance of the matter. Don't use any ad hominems, as it were, although that's par for the course on social media discourse nowadays. But anyways, that's my thought process on the matter. I hope it helps you arrive at a proper conclusion in all these things. I hope you think upon it. A couple of items before I sign off. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, click on the thumbs up button and share if you haven't done so on those things. If you have, thank you for doing that, and also share our content with others if you're edified by what we offer here on Irrespective. Don't forget to donate. It helps us to continue to keep the lights on here on Irrespective, to inform you and to edify you. There's a QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that you can scan. Conversely, there's a link that you can click on or tap on, depending on the device you use to watch this transmission, in the description box to donate. For those of you that have helped us materially, meaning financially, thank you so much for doing that. If you're going to support us for the first time, thanks for the consideration. Last but not least, follow us on X. Irrespective77 is the username there. And on TikTok, we are at the Irrespective. That's all the time I have left. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. This is Gio signing off until the next occasion that we gather, which will be on Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's our next live stream. I hope you'll join me then. Until then, adieu and Godspeed.